next major political revolution that we're going to see after the American Revolution would be the French Revolution. So when we look at the causes of the French Revolution, first off, the same Enlightenment ideas that inspired the American Revolution are also going to inspire the French Revolution. We're also going to see the American Revolution inspires the French Revolution. One of the big factors, though, that ultimately led to the outbreak of the revolution itself, though, was economic problems. France was suffering. They were in a ton of debt, especially after the 7 Years' War, and then helping the United States during the American Revolution and put them in an even further debt. And so with all this debt and this huge financial crisis, the King Louis XVI, really wasn't able to effectively deal with these growing issues. And the tax system in France was backwards. At this time, France was divided into 3 estates. And so the first estate was comprised of the church and the clergy. The second estate was your upper class nobility. And then the third estate was basically everybody else, all your common peoples and peasants of France. And pretty much all of the tax burden was on that third estate. And so, unable to deal with this growing financial issue, King Louis XVI decides to summon a meeting of the Estates General. Now, the meeting of the Estates General, this is an old assembly. It hadn't been used in about 150 years in France, but it was a meeting where each of the 3 estates got to send representatives, and the idea was that they could meet to help solve this financial crisis and ultimately create a new tax system to handle the growing debt and this financial crisis in France. And so at this meeting of the Estates General, the way it worked was each estate had 1 vote. And so even though the third estate made up most of France's population, they only had a single vote. And so anytime they tried to implement change, like raising taxes on the upper classes, the other 2 estates would simply override them. And so eventually the third estate gets fed up with the existing system, and they actually break away, and they're going to form a separate assembly. And so this gets us into the beginnings of the French Revolution. The National Assembly was created by representatives of this third estate that were upset that they really didn't have a voice in French society. And so they demanded a written constitution. They wanted popular sovereignty where people would have a voice in government. And they weren't allowed to meet at actual meeting houses. And so they find an old abandoned tennis court. And there you have the famous tennis court oath, where they basically held up in that abandoned tennis court, and under the tennis court oath promised not to leave until they had drafted a new constitution for France. The storming of the Bastille, this is the big event, the spark, that marks the official beginning of the French Revolution. And an angry mob is going to storm the Bastille, and the Bastille was just a French prison. And at the time they stormed it, most of the prison was empty. There weren't many prisoners actually in the Bastille. However, they storm it looking for weapons and ammunition, and they kill the prison general. They stick his head on a staff and parade his head throughout the city. And this big event marks the beginning of the French Revolution. They then proceed to tear down the old prison with their hands to kind of signify an end of the old ways. Meanwhile, the National Assembly is going to draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And the Declaration of Rights of Man is basically the Declaration of Independence for the French Revolution. And what it did is it ended social classes. It abolished the first and second estates. It made the church normal citizens, and basically created this kind of constitutional monarchy where all landowning men had the ability to vote. And so now we see France going from a monarchy to now the monarch having to share power with this assembly. So as the French Revolution continues, it becomes a bit more radical. And France was afraid that outside forces were going to invade. The revolutionaries were especially afraid that Austria and Prussia might try to take advantage of the situation and come in. And so they're actually going to launch a preemptive war. And so not only are they dealing with the revolution within France, but now they're dealing with outside war as well. And the king and queen try to flee. They end up getting caught. And at this point, they kind of lose all of their power. They were basically seen as abandoning their position. So the convention is going to abolish the monarchy and proclaim France a republic. And now we kind of get into the more radical phase of the revolution, known as the Reign of Terror. And during the Reign of Terror, Maximilien Robespierre is basically going to guide the revolution through his speeches. He had been a lawyer and was a great speaker and used it to kind of guide the path of the revolution. And almost during this Reign of Terror, almost rules as a dictator. But Robespierre basically began to argue that in order for the revolution to live, the king would have to die. And so both the king and later the queen are going to be put to death via the new invention of the guillotine. So the guillotine was invented. It was seen as a more humane way of putting people to death. But it would be used so often throughout the French Revolution, it gains the nickname of the National Razor. And so during this Reign of Terror, anybody that they felt was against the revolution, they put to death. And so thousands and thousands of people were put to death during this Reign of Terror. Now, eventually, people grew tired of this violence. There were also groups that wanted more meaningful reforms, especially for the lower classes. And so that's going to bring an end to this Reign of Terror. And so a new constitution is created. Maximilien Robespierre is actually put to death. That kind of brings an end to the more radical phase of the revolution. And this new directory is created to try to create kind of a middle path. It was a more conservative government, and ultimately kind of brought some order and stability temporarily back to France. So with the rise of this directory, we're also going to see the rise of Napoleon. Napoleon had been a very successful general during the French Revolution, and he's going to lead a coup d'etat. He's going to overthrow this weak directory government and seize power. And once he seized power, he basically rules as a dictator. It was an autocratic government, authoritarian government, but he implements a lot of the reforms that the revolutionaries had been pushing for. He made peace with the Roman Catholic Church and allowed religious toleration throughout France. He reforms the French economic system, creates an equal tax code to where now more people were responsible for bearing that burden of the tax system. He also creates a new code of laws, the Napoleonic Code, that basically gave political and legal equality to all adult men. And his new code of laws is going to serve as a basis for future codes of law throughout Europe. And so even though he did implement a lot of these reforms, one thing he definitely didn't allow was freedom of speech and freedom of the press. That was highly restricted under Napoleon. Now, aside from implementing these reforms, Napoleon also wanted territory. And so he's going to begin conquering and does a pretty fair job of taking over most of Central Europe, pushes into the Iberian Peninsula, ultimately didn't have a whole lot of success against Britain, but created a huge empire in Central and Western Europe and came to control most of that territory. But ultimately, he's going to come into trouble when he invades Russia. Russia was kind of the beginning of the end for Napoleon. And he marches into Russia with about 600,000 men and is caught off guard by the harsh Russian winter. And that Russian winter sets in, and as they try to retreat, well, then Russia begins to attack them all the way out of Russia. And of the 600,000 or so men that he goes into Russia with, he only makes it out with about 30,000. And a coalition of other European powers are going to come in and ultimately defeat Napoleon. One important side effect, though, of the French Revolution, and especially Napoleon's campaign, is the spread of nationalism, not just in France, but also throughout Europe, as well as other nations had to kind of protect themselves against France. So that's going to help encourage nationalism throughout Europe.